aka Philco Joe, the art martialist. Hey, what's up guys? I am getting this video to you a little bit later than usual because I took a trip to the zoo with the family and had a good time. Honestly, it was a little chilly and my nose is running and stuff, but nonetheless, the show must go on. So we're back for a third week, and with this episode, I just wanted to get into a little bit of depth perception while still talking about one-point perspective. So check this out, and stay tuned for the message at the end of the episode, and I will see you next week. Peace.
What's up, everybody? So for this week, as I mentioned last week, I wanted to draw an actual scene using one-point perspective, but what I want to do is use depth perception along with one-point perspective this week. Before jumping into that, I just wanted to do a quick breakdown on how I set up my any panel in a comic that I draw or any scene that I illustrate. And so what you see here is me using the rule of thirds, and that's essentially a rule where you want to use a grid, and on that grid you want to set up dots like what I have on the left hand side, and anything that you draw that is of importance should be roughly around those dots. So on the right hand side you see me doing sort of a rough layout of what I would draw in a comic book scene, and what you see here is me drawing Spider-Man and Wolverine. And so this is just basically a breakdown of how I would set my scene up, right? And so I just wanted to give a quick breakdown on how I go about setting up my scenes. And this is actually a pretty important step as far as trying to render anything, that will ultimately be a finished piece. So you definitely don't want to overlook that. Next, I'm basically doing a breakdown on how I'm going to draw the figures for this particular scene. I roughly went over this in last week's episode, and again, I'm using the method that was invented by Stan Lee and John Buscema from How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way. And this is just one of several different techniques that I use, but I think this is the easiest, and so this is just the one I'm going to stick with because it's really fast as far as laying out characters in the scene, and so that's the one I'm gonna go with. And now if you pay close attention to the reference photo in the upper right hand corner, this is the actual scene that I'm gonna work with this week. And just a quick breakdown again on perspective. What you have is a horizon line. The main dot in the middle is your PVP, or your principal vanishing point. It's basically the same point that you would see if you're looking down the scope of a gun. And as I had mentioned before, the entire line across is the horizon line, which is always at your eye level, right? This represents the edge of the earth, where the sky and the sea meets if you're standing on the beach. And so, if you lay down belly first on the beach, that eye level will drop. If you stand on the mountaintop, that eye level will rise. And so, just a quick rundown on that. So I'm getting straight into the depth perception, and what I did was basically pick a random spot, and not really random. I'm sticking pretty faithfully to the reference photo on the upper right hand corner. But what I did was start with the tree on the right, and then I scaled that tree back into perspective, and I took that same scale and I started spotting up locations for other trees that are roughly around the same height, and basically just finding places to scatter these additional trees throughout the scene. Now, you did see a couple of squiggly lines that I just made there at the bottom of the screen. Those are quick lines that I lay out that are pretty simple, but when you bunch those lines together and you use them in a group for foliage or for leaves on a tree, they read really well. And I'm again drawing those lines at the bottom what you want to do is you want to kind of maneuver those lines the same way that you would maneuver lines for a gesture, right? And now I'm creating a hill in the background because I feel like that's sort of what I'm reading in the reference photo in the top right corner. And so I just went ahead and indicated a hill, which is actually going to block the vanishing point that we see on the horizon line. And again, I'm just sort of demonstrating how the methods that I use for creating the foliage on the trees in the background. And so what I'm doing here is essentially just laying in a rough sketch. I only do 2 versions here, 2 trace overs, but I would probably do a third one in the finish. Now for the second trace over, what I'm doing is focusing on line drawing first and then solid drawing next, right? And so what I mean by that is if I'm drawing a cone for the line drawing, I'm just specifically focusing on the outline. But when I get into solid drawing, that's when I'm actually going to jump in and try to render the object and shadow and light, right? So you're going to see me recreate that same process here with the trees. So again, I am just kind of going in, and there you go, wiggling out those simple lines of foliage, and it's pretty quick to find a rhythm. The simpler the process, the easier it is to find a rhythm. And at this point, I don't want to get too carried away. This is essentially all based off of, again, the depth perception that I started with, where I find the scale for one tree. And speaking of depth perception, I'm demonstrating that you also have to operate in the foreground, a middle ground, and a background. Depth is very important as far as how you're reading an entire scene, because you're obviously going to have objects that are closer to you, which will read in the foreground, and then you're going to have things transition into the middle ground and then out into the background. But with the way that I work, and I'm just kind of breaking down different types of lines, like broken and suggestive lines, but I'll get more into detail about that stuff down the road. But just to get back to the point that I was making, and in my process when I'm working on a scene like this, I tend to run into trouble spots, and rather than force a certain area, I just tend to bounce back to the foreground, bounce back to the background, bounce up to the middle ground, and just continue back and forth with that process. But again, all of the stuff that you see me rendering right now, this is just the icing on the cake. It really comes down to making sure that you have a solid understanding of the depth perception, and that you're scaling things accurately, and this is just a demonstration of what you can do with just 1-point perspective, as far as laying out a scene. And what I'm demonstrating here is where I'm picking my light source, right? Later on down the road, I will break down how perspective can even govern the way you lay out shadows. But for this scene, at this point, I'm just having fun with it, and so I don't get too particular about how I lay out the shadows. And so then, it's just a lot of dressing at this point. This is when things go downhill. I decide to go and fill in more color, just so that some of these trees can stand out from the background, and go ahead and take out the demonstrations of light over there. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and start rendering the humans, jumping back to using depth perception with 1-point perspective. And so, I quickly lay out a couple of figures there, and just kind of went crazy there for a second. But here you go, right? And this is exactly what I did last week, where I just built one figure, and then you essentially saw me create other figures of the same scale just from this one figure, and again, we're just using a 1-point perspective, the principal vanishing point, and from that, I was able to scatter out a park full of trees and a handful of figures, right? And now this actual image probably took me about 50 minutes to draw. but I wanted to speed it up for you, and just so that you could quickly see the process. Nobody wants to sit for 58 minutes, but I have actually been working on this animation project, and I'm in a storyboard phase right now, and so I just kind of stuck to rendering quickly the way that someone would render with storyboards, and I like the way it turned out, but like I said earlier, this is this is definitely a second draft, and if I were to make this a finished piece, I have plenty to work with at this point, and what I would do is just drop the opacity here and then go back over it with a third piece and just render that in. So this is where I ended this piece for the most part. Again, like I said before, man, I just wanted to mess around with depth perception, show you guys how it works with 1-point perspective. Thank you for tuning in. If you know of anyone who would like this, feel free to share this with them. Next week, I will be back with more details on 1-point perspective and rendering another scene. So until then, take care.